Good afternoon, good evening, and Lá Féile Breed. I'm Sally Bourne. I'm the Second Secretary with the Embassy of Ireland in Ottawa, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's event. Today's event is called Women and the Future, Feminist Perspectives on Global Challenges. Over the next hour or so, we'll hear from three amazing campaigners and activists on their work, on women's impact on policy, and on current issues facing us today. Just to start with a couple of house rules, I would ask that everyone keep themselves on mute while the panelists are having their discussion. And if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat during the session or towards the end of the session. We do hope to take a few questions from the audience before things cut off at the end. So to introduce our panelists, first up we have Karol Balfe. Karol is the CEO of ActionAid Ireland, having come into that role last year. Prior to that, she worked for 9 years with Christian Aid as head of global peace building, head of programs, and advisor on governance and human rights. She's worked in the international human rights, development, and peace building sectors for nearly 20 years now, and has also worked with Oxfam and Amnesty International. Karol, it's a pleasure to have you here today. Next up, we have Dr. Grainne Healy. Grainne is well known in Ireland, particularly for being the co-director on the Yes Equality campaign, which won the referendum on marriage equality for same-sex marriage in 2015. Grainne, however, also does a lot of other things, including being chairwoman, evaluator, researcher, social inclusions leader, published author, and a campaigns expert. Her areas of expertise include gender equality, LGBTQ+ rights, violence against women, leadership skills, and strategy and social inclusion in Ireland and the EU. Our final panelist today is the Honourable Catherine McKenna. Catherine is the founder and principal of Climate and Nature Solutions. She was a member of Parliament for Ottawa Centre from 2015 to 2021 and served both as the Minister for Environment and Climate Change and the Minister for Infrastructure and Communities. She was a lead negotiator on the Paris Agreement and also introduced and successfully defended legislation that established a carbon price across Canada. Her latest appointment is as a distinguished visiting fellow in the Centre on Global Energy Policy in Columbia University. So I'm delighted to have the three of you here. Thank you so much for joining us today. I might kick off with the first question, which is just a small one. What do you think is the biggest challenge facing the world over the next 10 years? Karol, I might start with you.
Great, thanks so much. And it's really lovely to be here and to see lots of friendly faces in Canada from Dublin. Yeah, so I think in terms of the next 10 years, and it isn't an easy question to start with, but I think really what we're facing is a set of crises. And obviously with the pandemic, that has been most to the fore of everybody's mind, but it really just has underpinned and exacerbated another set of crises that I think are very much there. Economic inequality, the climate crisis, the growing number of humanitarian disasters, conflict, gender inequality. The COVID-19 pandemic built on the inequalities that come with all of these intersecting crises. And I think in terms of kind of the two ones to kind of really draw out from that, in terms of the economic crisis that we face, and I think it's woven so strongly into the climate crisis and what we've experienced with the pandemic, but we have an economic system that is broken, that is failing our people and our planet. And that is the big issue, I think, that's really deeply connected with the climate crisis that we have, that is driven by this economic model that is exploitive, extractive, and that is really failing us really badly as a human species and as a planet and in terms of biodiversity. So I think that is at the foundation of what we have to grapple with, is really looking at this economy that we have. And how do we shift away from this singular focus that growth is what's required, and looking and really shifting the paradigm that we've had for the last 40 years, which is that the state should be rolled back. Public goods and services have been privatized. We've seen women's unpaid work and unpaid care undervalued. We've seen exploitation of the South from the North. And I think it is one of the issues that really is the linchpin of all these intersecting crises that we face. And it's felt most acutely by women in terms of the disproportionate impact. And then that's further compounded depending on, mix that with your identity, your race, your disability, your sexual orientation, all of these discriminations become more and more compounded. So I think in terms of the future, and one of the big issues that we have to tackle as feminists is really shifting this paradigm that has led us into such a terrible position over the last 40 years, and really looking for an economic model that is feminist, that is just, and that is about a transition that is grounded in a different type of world that values human rights and care.
That's a really interesting point there, and just a really interesting perspective. I think it's one that I worked in ActionAid myself a few years ago, and it's one that I think was brought up then. A very good friend of mine introduced me to some reading on it. But when you look at, again, the economic model, and you look at, I think, where we would be with kind of more women-led influence on that economic model, I think you find overwhelmingly in countries that adopt that they turn towards kind of more of a socialist perspective and more of a socialist kind of model. So I think it's a really interesting point as well to hear about intersectionality. For me, I have a very small sort of knowledge of intersectionality. My mother is Sri Lankan, and obviously there's kind of these different backgrounds. But also I have many friends that come from those different backgrounds. And I think it's the multiplication factor of inequality that I think sometimes becomes most difficult and is sometimes ignored. I think often we try and say we're going to improve the rights of one group of people, and we forget that those rights also impact other groups of people, or that they can't kind of be separated into these very clear distinctions of one kind of rights versus another kind of rights. So thanks so much for that answer, Karol. Catherine, I might go to you next.
Well, thanks very much. It's great to be here with Grainne and Karol, and happy St. Bridget's Day. I learned a lot. Not only is it the start of spring, which really hardly feels like that in Ottawa, at least we're February, because January is colossally terrible. But also St. Bridget is celebrating strong women. So I'm glad to have strong women. And she also apparently turned water into beer. So that's an amazing miracle. We could all use a beer. We all need a pint right now. Well, look, I mean, I think that, Karol covered a lot of ground. I do think that we have multiple crises at the same time. I would add, I mean, obviously the climate crisis, I think that's an overarching crisis. It's an exacerbator. It is something that we're seeing the impacts right now, disproportionate impacts on women, but also on minorities. So there's the intersectionality with minorities, with Indigenous peoples, and then, layer on, if you're a woman and you're living in poverty, whether you're living often if somewhere in a floodplain, or you are a medicine keeper, an Indigenous woman, or you are a single mother living in Africa, and you have to go long distances for water or for firewood, or you're in very vulnerable situations. But I would layer onto that, and I guess it's, I heard some honking. I don't know, maybe everyone's muted now, so we can't hear the honking. I think we have another crisis. We have a crisis of democracy. And I worry about this greatly, because climate and democracy and inequality are all linked. And I think we have to be extremely careful. I think we in Canada often take it for granted that we have a strong democracy and we're very different from our neighbors. But we've seen we are not immune, in particular right now. I think it's in our face, but that the rise of hate and extremism and the alt-right is a huge challenge. And it's going to be, as you think about climate change and tackling inequality, you need democracy, because the folks that are the most impacted have the least voice. And the folks that are saying they're representing the downtrodden, I'm pretty sure if you go down to the streets of Ottawa, that's not what's happening. In fact, they're actually attacking them, sadly, and preventing very vulnerable people from getting food and water and medicines. And so I think that those are challenges that need to be tackled, but in a positive frame. And because we have women, many women here, and men who support women, I think women really are leading the way. And I know we'll get into that. I can talk a little bit about what I've seen in terms of climate change. And one of the real leaders, because we all are Irish or want to be Irish, or or Irish on St. Patrick's Day, is certainly Mary Robinson. She's been a real hero of mine, and she's been a voice for climate and justice, which I think it's a very important agenda, and you really need to link those.
That's great. Thanks so much, Catherine. Again, some really interesting perspectives. I love that linking of democracy with some of the issues that we're facing. And I think it's becoming more and more prevalent, that issue, I think, especially when we're looking at how kind of populist movements come about and how quickly people, I think, can join into those, and how do we maybe counter that and really use kind of fact-based knowledge, I think, in the modern era to promote kind of, I think, our own ideals, our own kind of values, for Ireland as a country, but also for individuals. Grainne, what's your biggest challenge over the next 10 years?
I mean, it's been touched on by previous speakers. I mean, climate is the next 10 years is really going to tell all. But maybe before we get into that, just to say it's lovely to see so many faces here this evening, and to be here with Karol and with Catherine. And, in many ways, this evening is about, the change we want to see, and it is about women looking to Bridget. I mean, growing up, Bridget, funnily enough, was not one of the saints that the Catholic Church in my education held up as a model for women, because she was very bold. She sold things that didn't belong to her to make money for poor people, and she got land that didn't belong to her so she could build her convent, and she got it by hook or by crook. So she was not a woman who was the model for women when I was growing up and was educated in my Dominican convent. But as I got older and grew into my feminist identity, she was a woman who really, she's superb. And if you get a chance to read about her and her life, and we're delighted that we're going to have a patron saint day for Bridget from next year. So 2023, we will have a day as we have St. Patrick's Day. So we will have Bridget's Day, the closest day to the 1st of February. And we, many women here today already celebrating that here online, and, going to various holy sites around Ireland. And last night, putting our scarves out so that Bridget would come and bless them, and very good for sore throat. So all of those stories, and, obviously myths and wonderful myths, but part of our culture. But what they do, I think, is, they show for me the value of a feminist discourse in the crises that we're facing. And that feminist discourse is about the things that people have mentioned. It's about solidarity, north and south, but also between men and women. I think the idea of looking at how are we going to basically have a planet that will be livable for, I have a grandson who's 8.5. I worry for him. I worry about him, his future. Will water be an issue for him? It is already for many millions of children around the world. So I think climate has many arms, and a lot of what we are hearing, the misinformation, the thing Catherine spoke about, I think that's a huge issue, that people are, their fears are being played on, and the way in which we're framing this discussion, we've got to get the right frame. I mean, a lot of the work that I've been involved in over years around campaigns has been about framing. So how we frame the fact that we've all got to change how we live our lives in order to ensure that the planet survives. It's that serious and it's that urgent, but being able to communicate that message in a way that we understand why we're doing it and how we're doing it, and the importance of doing it. Within that, I think, for me, gender equality, I have great concerns. I see gender equality slipping back on many of the agendas of some countries that you would think, oh, it's done. They've had suffrage for years, women have had rights, but we do see a slipping back. And we also see an upsurge. The COVID pandemic really, I think, threw us into another pandemic here in Ireland, and that was around domestic and sexual gender-based violence. we saw far more women being abused, murdered on the streets in their own homes. And that, I think, is something that is part of a sort of a backlash that's going on, a backlash against women. Let's keep them in their place. Let's make sure they're not like Bridget. So I think that a lot of these conversations that we've started here in the first opening, they're very much linked, and they are about what can a feminist analysis bring, and what can we as feminists do to build solidarity. And was it Alice Walker who told us, each one pull one? We need to be bringing other younger women with us and up behind us.
That's another fantastic answer. So thank you so much, Grainne. I think, women's influence on framing and on, how do women protect other minority groups and how do we kind of lift those groups up is so important. And I think one of the things that I've really noticed is when you have women's influence on information, on campaigns, I think what you find is often it's very compassionate. It comes from a place of wanting to understand why somebody believes what they do or how they came to that conclusion, and really working with them to maybe change their minds a little bit or change their perspective. I think the 2015 campaign was a great example. I went door to door at the time myself, and it was so based on personal experience and anecdotes. And I think that was what changed people's minds in both of our recent referendums, was the humanity and the compassion element of it. Yeah. So I think that's always a fantastic influence. I guess in terms of discrimination, then I might ask you to start, Grainne. How do you see women affecting change in this area? How can women continue not only to campaign for our own rights, but to continue for just less discrimination globally against all groups?
Yeah, I mean, I think as we've already said, it is a challenge. You mentioned the two referendum that we had here, and the marriage equality referendum was about a small group of people a set of rights that had been denied them, the right to marry the person you love. And that campaign, which people say, gosh, it happened so quickly, like we were working on it for about 15 years, and then we had a marriage equality referendum campaign which was about 6 months long. So one of those overnight successes that takes 15 years, and many of the change makers on the call this evening will recognize that as a campaigning experience. But we started conversations. Changing hearts and minds is about having conversations, and that's the framing bit. And we talked about, we did work to find out what are the values, what are the things that in an Irish context, Irish people feel proud about, or they want to live their lives according to what values. And they were the values that we hung our campaign on. Similarly, the repeal campaign, which got rid of the dreadful abortion legislation in Ireland, which saw the death of Savita Halappanavar, and it was really that was the impetus to run that referendum campaign to repeal the Eighth Amendment. And they had three core values, care for women and the situation they found themselves in, compassion, even if it wasn't something you would do for yourself, to allow other women to do it, and then change. Nobody wanted us to continue with all the dark old days in Ireland where people had to go to England for their reproductive health, where people were suffering in silence, where the Catholic Church was enabling and supporting this, and indeed the medical profession wasn't really rowing out as they should be. So change became what people wanted. And 67% voted yes to change something that I think even 5 years before the referendum, there was a sense of, oh, let's not talk about abortion. It's far too divisive. But the right narrative and the right values brought the people, and I think it was an invitation to Irish people to say, this is who we really are. We may no longer be the island of saints and scholars that Bridget was in. We're a modern country, and people have a sense of doing the right thing. And both of those referendum results were about that. So, I think there's something about starting conversations with feminism at the heart of it. Feminism is as much about equality for men as it is about equality for women. And I think the feminist solidarity and intersectionality is really important. Leaving no one behind is such an important message in all of these campaigns. And I think building allies, is really important. So, I think being a change maker, and everyone has the capacity to be a change maker. But for us, I think here in Ireland, and for my own work then internationally, there is something about building values-based movements. And in doing that, I think we get to connect with the basic human values that we all share. And that's a great way, I think, of silencing and dissipating some of the fears and a lot of our oppositions, those who are not in favour of equality, those who are anti-feminist, those who are anti so many rights that we would all support and stand for, including democracy, as Catherine mentioned. That fear, if we can combat the fear and get people to think, actually, we can live a life informed by these values globally, then I think you see the movements happening, and they are happening. I have great hope. I have great fears at times, but ultimately I am optimistic that we can overcome many of these challenges.
It's great to hear that, and I think sometimes I lose the optimism as well. So it's so nice and so powerful, I think, when you have somebody else to tell you, we're doing the work, we continue to do the work, and people do care. I think it always is such a nice message to hear. Karol, you balance a fine line, I know, in ActionAid's programs, of working to stop discrimination, of working on women's rights, but on working on how to bring the rest of the community along. Because as we've seen time and time again, women can campaign for their rights for years and very little changes. It's when the rest of the institution and the systems kind of share that power that women are able to really achieve what we need to achieve. So how do you see women's influences being able to, I guess, stop discrimination and kind of advocate for the rights of others?
I think working with women activists in some of the areas that we do, like in Kenya, Ethiopia, and Nepal, I think there's such a responsibility to really think through what the backlash will be against women who are working on these issues, because that's guaranteed there will be backlash. And I think for women themselves, it is nearly always the women themselves who know best how to deal with that backlash and to understand that in the best possible way. But I think that's the first key kind of cornerstone, if you like, that has to be really core to approaches and how, when local organizations are working with women, that there is time. And I think within the international context, that's really important for donors to emphasize when they're funding that work in countries as well. I think the other thing, it can feel so removed. So if you're working, as many of the communities that we work with, to end FGM or to end the practice of girls being locked in literally a shed for 3 days when they have their period because of the shame of it. You're talking about societal issues that are deeply embedded, social norms, patriarchal issues. But I think one of the challenges, and I think the challenge for all of us, is to connect those experiences at the very community level to the big issues that are happening, because they are connected. And I think sometimes we can get lost in connecting those issues. And there is this overwhelming sense of, patriarchy is so entrenched. Capitalism is so entrenched in its current form. All of these things are aspects that really further compound women's marginalization. So even, many development projects work with women at the local level to do economic empowerment and income generation. But it's no good if, the woman can make a little bit more money, but she goes out into a society that is still deeply discriminatory towards her. So that's the case of, unless we're looking at, is the state actually funding public services? Is it funding the provision of gender-based violence services? Is it looking at its responsibility to its citizens from a human rights perspective? Is it thinking about women in its macroeconomic policy? And you can be pretty sure the answer is 9 times out of 10 no, but it should be. And I think that's why, we need to do this really rooted community work. We need to be there in solidarity with women. It's women driving it, it's not us. But we also need to connect these issues and support those feminists in the countries where we work that are really driving those changes. And I think, there's so many issues that we can feel overwhelmed. And I think I read something recently about young people just feeling this climate grief, because there's this sense of, the destruction and what can you do and how can you change it? And some of this, I mean, the changes that are required are profound and radical, but it isn't rocket science. You know, we need to stop producing as much as we do. We need to have states that actually value human rights and care. You know, I don't think it's a socialist model. I think we had this model up before, you know, the 1980s. It's something that's within our capability to do. We need to listen to communities about what they want. There's many different types of feminism. There's many different types of solutions. And if we're really listening and grounded at the local level, if we're being inclusive, if we're trying to address inequalities, not exacerbate them in our climate policies, in our economic policies. So it can feel overwhelming, but I think in terms of challenging discrimination, we have to connect it to these bigger issues and struggles. And I think some of the most exciting things that have happened over the last while is even looking at the Black Lives Matter protests from afar and seeing the connection that movement has made with Palestine, for example, I think is an example of that connection and the link between North and South and the importance of that, because part of this problem as well is that the global South is really paying for the excesses of the global North and continues to pay. And we're not responding because we're not seeing it in the same way. I mean, we are seeing it, but not to the same degree that communities are suffering because of the economic model that we have and because of climate change. And I think that's as feminists from the global North, it is our responsibility, our role to have that connection with the South as well, and to really link up those big picture issues. And I think to connect back to the narrative, I mean, I think people want change. You know, people are ahead of the political curve on this. And there was a Financial Times survey recently of under 35s in Europe, and most of them don't believe that capitalism is a good model. So, you know, there are people that see this as a broken system that is within the bounds of our possibility. It doesn't mean socialism. It just means we reprioritize the social contract. We reprioritize the state. We prioritize public services. We stop the mass privatization of public goods. We don't deregulate labor. All of these things that are within our gift to do, they're not kind of, out there completely, out of field socialist proposals. They're things that we have done and we can do again. Proper taxation is a big feminist ask in the global South. And, that is the most important way that a state can deliver regular, progressive, sustainable income for its citizens. And we need to stop corporations, surviving as they do, benefiting as they do from the low corporate tax that compounds all of this problem even further.
Thanks so much, Karol. A lot to think about there. Catherine, I know that you have you've done a lot of work recently, in particular around kind of online bullying and that form of discrimination, particularly against women activists and women change makers. So what do you think is our steps in that? How do we kind of, I guess, promote less discrimination?
Overthrow the system? No. First of all, I have to note my parents are here. Thank you, Mom and Dad. I think I forgot to invite you, so that's nice of you to join. You could be on the beach, but here you are. Look, I think that I'm kind of joking, overthrow the system, but I'm kind of not. I mean, because I know the question originally, or at least I saw it, was about the system being built by men for men, and that's a problem. And I think it is really important that, we change how we do things. And the way you do that is by speaking up yourself personally, to the extent you're in a position of privilege and you're able to do that, but also creating spaces for others who aren't. And I certainly saw that. I mean, in my experience, I don't know, the Canadians kind of know it's like kind of irritating that I'm kind of known as Climate Barbie, but for a long time I said nothing. For a year, that was so hilarious. I didn't even play with Barbie dolls as a kid. And so it was supposed to diminish me. And I mean, there were many other names and many other things that happened, but I didn't do anything because everyone told me, don't speak up because then you're going to become a target. And one day I was just really pissed off. So I just said to my team, thanks very much, but you're just, I got my phone out and I just called it out. I just said, like, would you use this kind of language for your mother, your sister, your girlfriend? Like, no, so don't use it on me because women need to go into politics. And it was interesting because who was it? The reason I did it, that I was so mad, is it was actually a parliamentarian who'd been a former minister. And I realized, though, then everyone came up to me afterwards. It was almost embarrassing, but I had like dads who would say, I show those videos to my kids. Or I'd have, women who would just come off the streets and say, thank you, for doing that. And I think that they want different role models, and they want people to keep it real. And I think that, and it's been amazing to see all the women. So congratulations to you. Also, I mean, even grandfathers. I know there was a grandfather movement, wasn't it? For the abortion referendum. That we need to do things differently, and we have to act like real people. And if we're mad, we're allowed to be mad. And if we're upset, we're allowed to be upset. And I have to give a shout out, because some of you, if you haven't read the story, it's quite an interesting story. My cousin, Siobhan McKenna, she's mixed race, Irish. She wrote an article, a piece talking about being in a mother and baby home at 3 days old. And she's now head of gender diversity inclusion, I think, for a big public service recruiting agency. And she just spoke up about her experiences and the outpouring. I mean, she's hilarious. She's great. She's super fun, but she just could not imagine this outpouring that she received, because it resonated with so many people. And I think it was a wake-up call too, because I think we all need to be sometimes shaken up. We've seen that in Canada with, in particular, with Indigenous children. That are literally buried at schools across Canada, including Catholic schools, yes. I think that is the power. So the downside is that, yes, social media is terrible and appalling, and there's extremism, and there are very nasty people out there, but it is a bit of an equalizer, and it allows you to amplify voices. And I think you can be an ally, and that's men as much as women. We definitely need men. It can't just be conversations amongst women, and, kind of doing it your own way. And that's been, it's very hard in politics to do that, because people give you all sorts of free advice. But I think that's the one thing that I felt was helpful to me. I would just say, okay, what do I really believe? And what do I really want to say? And what's important. And the thing that is also nerdy, so now I'll go on the nerdy side. We brought in what's called a gender-based analysis to all policy in government. And people are like, oh my gosh, they're so annoying as a government. Some people, like, why would gender-based analysis be meaningful? But you saw it across the board. If you actually sat back and thought about policies, that often they have unequal, or they have unintended consequences when you bring in policies that you may decide you want to be helping women in developing countries, but by the way you're funding a project, you're actually excluding those voices, or you're hurting women even worse, or girls. And so it does matter to have discipline in how you approach problems, and to really be grounded in outcomes. And how are you going to get those outcomes? By being, very focused on what are you trying to do, and what tools do you have to do them.
That's great. I think, that's one of the main problems that women face, is that we're so often categorized either as, being too emotional, too compassionate, too feminine, or if you're not that, you're the other way, and you're cold, and you're bossy, and you're all these kind of things. And I think that labeling, it's really interesting. And I think sometimes then the answer to how do women navigate, systems built by men for men, is just by being ourselves, and really standing up for what we believe in, speaking out, and I guess not playing into those systems, but also like not shying away from some of those structures, and using those structures for positive change, which I think is key. Grainne and Karol will know that in Ireland, we have a very low number of women politicians, which I think is being helped now. There's lots of institutions and organizations that are working on that. But I think part of that has been things like maternity leave policy that are quite easy to change, once you come into practice. And we're thankfully, I think, seeing a bit of change there. Grainne, did you want to speak?
Yeah, no, just, on the we've had a number of really good female ministers for justice, and justice was always a very male-dominated portfolio. And the most recent one got pregnant, and there was no maternity leave for ministers. Who would take her seat at the cabinet table? My goodness, they hadn't thought about this before. Why? Because the system is built by men, for men, and by and large, they don't get pregnant. So we had, a constitutional crisis. Should we give her maternity leave? Can she still be a minister? If she has a baby, who's going to sit at the table when she's not there? So lo and behold, one of the other cabinet ministers decided she'd share the portfolio with her. She went off, she had her baby, she took her leave, and now she's back. And actually, she's a super minister, and she's doing lots of really good work, particularly around domestic sexual and gender-based violence. But that was a constitutional crisis in Ireland within the last year, and that is part of the, if you can't have a baby, if you've got to give up the job you love doing because you can't get childcare. I mean, very much what you're saying, Catherine, about the need for policy makers to have that gendered lens to say, actually, if we do this policy, let's just have a look, just on one level, how does it impact women? How does it impact men? Because I do think many of the unintended consequences, and historically we could name others, but that's just one example of that. Breastfeeding in the House of Parliament was another one. They had it in the UK within the last couple of years as well. So these really important spaces where women are in small-ish numbers, depending on what country you're in, moving into the key policy and leadership and governance spaces, there are still some very fundamental. And I think it's hard for the women who are in those seats to be the ones to do the change, but actually, I think that comes with the appointment, and the more women who do it, the more we create that kind of a movement for change, the more it happens, and the next generation don't have to be wasting their time fighting those battles that should have been put to bed years ago.
Yeah, I think gender-based analysis is always a worthwhile lens to look at anything through. I think largely because women historically have always been told to be quiet, and to not bring up these issues and personal issues or issues that stem from being a woman or having that perspective. And so I think when you do gender-based analysis, you often come up with these issues that nobody's actually thought about in terms of policy making, which have such an impact on the communities and on people. So, one of my favorite examples is one of the Nordic countries decided to do gender-based analysis in their policies, and they looked at snow plowing. So that's very relevant to Canada, but they looked at, what's the policy on how do we plow? And they found that they did the roads first. And when they finally looked at it with a gender-based policy, they said, well, actually, women and children use the pads. So why aren't we doing the pads at the same time, or the pads first? And I just think that's such a small example of just how it impacts every single thing we do and every decision that we make. And also just that women's, opinions and women's lived experiences really have to still be pushed for in kind of everything we do. So on that note, I have another very tricky question. So I'll start with Karol this time. But what's your favorite example of impactful change, policy or otherwise, that's come from a feminist or gender-based perspective?
I think following on from that, there's been some really interesting examples from women-led political administrations like Iceland and Scotland, looking at valuing care and looking at well-being as frameworks. Uruguay have taken that further in terms of a more detailed framework on care, looking at the care of children, the cost of childcare, unpaid care, valuing care. So it's one of several Latin American countries looking at that. So politically, I think there's lots out there that shows this narrow focus. And I think, back to the example of having a pregnant minister of justice, if things have been looked at through a care and gender perspective, it just opens up all of these kind of very, immediate human issues that are part of our lives that we just undervalue and ignore because women do the most of those issues and things. But one example, and we actually have a really interesting paper as ActionAid looking at feminist economic alternatives, but there's a fantastic example from a group of farming associations in West Africa, and they're called We Are the Solution. So it's a network of about 800 farmers, women-led organizations who have been lobbying for agroecology, which is moving away from the big industrial type farming to much more sustainable, much more valuing of local indigenous practices. and they've actually influenced the policy in Senegal, and at the level of the president, they're looking at agroecology and a transition there. So I think that type of change where you see it being led by women, their experience, women's movements is really, really powerful. And the other thing that I think in terms of practice, it's how we do things, and particularly, I suppose, coming from the space of an international development organization. And I think one of the most exciting things that ActionAid does is it's women-led humanitarian response. And typically within the humanitarian space, it's very male dominated. It's often males who work as humanitarian advisors within different organizations. It's often the male response that's looked at. So to have a response that is really about recognizing the agency of women who are providing those connecting roles at a community level when there is a disaster, that I think is something that I find inspirational.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I think it is really interesting to see, I think, women's just perspectives coming to the forefront, and that idea of the care work and, you know, well-being as a framework, it's more and more, I think, coming to the forefront. You know, one of the most interesting studies that I read was to say that, you know, in the time that it takes a woman to do the regular kind of chores, childcare, etc. in a house, in the span of a year, she does enough extra labor in terms of hours that a man could get a PhD. Like, and I think that's just such an insane fact, but I think it's so representative of these issues that I think sometimes aren't discussed, and that kind of care, well-being work, community work that goes on behind the scenes. So yeah, Catherine, what would you say is your favorite example of women-led policy or change?
Well, I started an organization called Women Kicking It on Climate. I've rebranded since I left government, Women Leading on Climate, but it's really actually on climate change. I went to the Paris negotiations, and it was amazing to see the role of women. There was the head of the COP, so the climate negotiations, was a woman. The French lead negotiator was a woman. There were many women ministers that were tasked with helping with very difficult issues. I was one of them, but there were a number of women. There was Mary Robinson, who was there advocating on behalf of those who didn't have a voice, linking climate and justice. You had women labor leaders, activists, and it was just incredible to see. And we would not have had an ambitious Paris Agreement, as ambitious as it is, striving for 1.5 degrees, if we didn't have the voices of women, 100%. And I just think it shows, I mean, and then we could give the example of Greta, who just basically sat alone. There's a picture of her sitting alone outside of her parliament. And she started a huge movement, which has had a massive, massive impact. And world leaders are scared of her, literally scared of Greta and all the young people, many young women. And so I think that there is, it's really amazing to see. And the question is why? So why, you know, are women playing such a role? And I think it goes back to what Grainne was saying. I mean, it's personalized for women. Like, women don't just sort of say climate is a thing out here and then there's my life here. I mean, climate is your life. It's your children. It's, you know, the issues you care about. It's about the foods you eat. It's about the air you breathe. It is for Indigenous women. It's about, you know, their role as, you know, potentially an elder or a medicine woman. And so it's, women have a way of understanding issues, which I think is really important. I don't want to overgeneralize. Obviously, there's a diversity in how women approach issues, but even that diversity, I think, is quite rich. And so I've just been super impressed. I started this new organization, and, you know, we're going to focus on practical things like training women negotiators, because what happens at the table, I will tell you, there's 100%, it's been studied that women are less likely to be lead negotiators. They did a study at the climate conferences, and men were likely to speak twice as long. So that is not surprising. So, you know, we do need to train women, provide mentorship, support them, support younger women, support diversity of women, support women in developing countries. But I just have been so impressed. And I just decided, you know what, there's also solidarity in being with other women, because it can be quite lonely. There is, I mean, I'm not even talking about myself. Yes, there was a lot of hate online, but I mean, I had a lot of support. But for a lot of women that are in developing countries that are working on climate issues, it's actually dangerous. They're organizing, that people do not like that. Often you're organizing against entrenched interests. And so they really do need opportunities and support. And younger women don't, often the access to education or access to employment in the area of climate is very challenging. So but the women are kicking it. They're really kicking it on climate, which has been really amazing to see.
It is really nice. And I think that, it's just fantastic, I think, especially to see young women and girls involved in the climate change movement. You talked about Greta, but I know there's a lot of young Indigenous Canadian girls as well who've been very involved and kind of very vocal in the media, which is, I think, just really powerful. Grainne, same question to you. What do you think is the most impactful?
Yeah, well, I think maybe following on from that, I've also been really excited to see, just that crossover between young LGBT activists who are also, they're the same people who are going on the marches. They're the same people who are wanting to work in organizations like ActionAid. They are going after their own passion. What is it that is important to them? And in many ways, they're leading with their heart and their head on these things. I mean, looking back historically, an example of impactful change, I think we forget, women's suffrage is quite young in terms of its history. And it was about women who went before us and men who were willing to fight for that equality and fighting and continuing to try to make that something that we can exercise. So, I think we saw, and there are always, I think Margaret Mead told us that, it's always one person who starts the change. So, and various campaigns I've been involved in, it usually is, over a couple of glasses of wine with 3 or 4 other women, and the idea comes up, and the next thing you know, you're in a 10-year campaign for whatever it might be. But it starts with those conversations with 1 or 2 people who either feel something is really unfair, or they have a real passion to think that they can change something. And I pay tribute to the 2 women who started the marriage equality campaign in Ireland, Catherine Zappone and Anne-Louise Gilligan, who were married in Canada and came back to Ireland with their wedding certificate and said, "We'd like to be treated as a married couple, please." And the Revenue Commissioner said, "No, you can't." And that's what started the marriage equality movement in Ireland. So there's something about, those individuals who put themselves forward. I mean, Catherine is one of those people. We've seen that in the stand and the decisions that she's taken as a public representative. And I think they are hard spaces to be, and we've got to support women into those spaces. But I think there are a lot of exciting developments that I see of those crossover campaigns. So it's not just in silos. And I'm really hopeful about that we're breaking out of those silos of, you wouldn't know anyone who was involved in climate action 20 years ago because they were all over there with the Greens. Those silos are breaking down, and we are seeing more of that cross-sectoral movement building. And I'm very hopeful because of that.
That's great. I think that's so true. And I think what is nice to see is young people, I think, are just so, I think the majority of them are so compassionate and so involved in a way that, I don't even know that I was as compassionate as involved as a teenager, but they really seem to get it, and to get that they shouldn't just care about their issues. They should be trying to care about the issues of the people who have less of a voice than them. And I think that's such a beautiful thing to see. I guess on that note, how would you guys, what would you say to a young woman or a young person who really is passionate about making change, really passionate about kind of current issues, but maybe doesn't know where to start, might find things overwhelming, has that passion, but doesn't know how to take action? What would you kind of say to motivate them or to give them a step in the right direction? Karol, I might start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think the type of young person that we're talking about here that is, energized, that is looking at the world, seeing it, I think they see an injustice. and they want to act on it, and they can see how it can be different. And I think that's the thing that I'd say to them: hold on to that injustice. And I think that's based on some of the most inspirational people I've met are in their 80s who never lost that sense of injustice and that clarity. And I think Mary Robinson is one of them, that things can be different, they should be different, and this is what we look for. And I think as a young person, you know, you can get beaten down by things not changing, and you can feel so frustrated and so overwhelmed. But it's actually, we need those good soldiers keeping fighting and keeping that, you know, that sense of injustice, that they continue to do things and continue to advocate for things to be different well up into their 80s and 90s. I think, you know, they have definitely been the people who've inspired me.
That's great. Catherine, what would you say to somebody young trying to get involved?
I mean, just do it. And it doesn't have to be, I mean, often I think young people really, and I did this too, mull it over, what's the perfect opportunity? It doesn't work like that. I mean, you can go help, you know, with your neighbor next door. And that can be very impactful and have a, you know, real influence. Political campaigns, I always tell people, get involved. I don't care what party, and if, you know, find out about politics, because you may want to get involved. You may want to run, or you may want to help behind the scenes. Certainly you should vote. But I think that there's a whole range of ways. And I think, you know, you don't have to be perfect. I think young women in particular always think everything has to be perfect and laid out. That's not how my life was. It was, you know, kind of messy at times. And I think just get involved. Because I think that's how you meet people who can serve as mentors, who can support you. And often it's starting locally. I mean, you know, I think it's great if you can afford to go abroad and have the opportunity to do that. But sometimes, it, you know, you have to spend your own money, and it can be expensive. And you can go help with your local food bank. And you can actually learn about real issues and about the real world. And life is hard for many people. And so I think there's a whole range of different ways of getting involved. But I do think that there are also amazing women out there that really have led the way. And so to the extent you're able to connect with them, I think that's also really important. And I think that's an interesting insight, that often there's a clarity of purpose if, you know, you had to fight the real fights. And I'm not saying there aren't real fights, there are still real fights right now. But sometimes people can say it's not that bad. But you look at, you know, how far and how hard fought some of the battles were, and look at what's going on in the United States right now. Rolling back a whole range of rights, including abortion rights, but also, you know, voting rights for minorities. So, you know, things can quickly change, which gets back to my point on democracy and climate, and how these issues are really linked. But I mean, I think the most important point is just get involved in whatever way. So your student council, doesn't matter, but just start somewhere, get engaged, and then other opportunities will come.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, that idea of connecting with other women, connecting with other people who have that perspective or have had that experience is really powerful. You know, representation matters. And I think, you know, for young women, especially, if you see someone involved in policy and politics and change, it becomes less scary and it becomes more doable. And I think that's, you know, that's one of the things that has been really nice about watching Greta Thunberg, is seeing somebody who I think looks like a lot of young women, and he's done something very powerful. So she, you know, those kind of inspirations. Grainne, do you have anything to add to that there?
No, I think follow your passion, but I guess sometimes it's also about maybe turning that around to, you know, what can we do? You know, I mean, I'm 62. How many more years have I got to be able to do this? I intend to keep going, but I'm really, like, a couple of us were running a leadership development program for those who are working in the NGO sector who can't afford the kind of fees that some of these leadership programs. So we ran this program basically on a shoestring, and in bringing together, and they were mostly women who came in who are maybe second in command in some of the NGO organizations here, working on really interesting issues from migration to adult education, and bringing them in and bringing them together to form a network. So they're talking to others at their own age and stage in their careers, and then bringing into that room leaders, bringing in, you know, the Mary Robinsons, bringing in the leaders from politics, from public life. And the interesting thing is that when we invited those people in to meet, I mean, no more than 20 people who were on a course, on a program, very, very few of them turned us down. because they get the value. They get the value of coming into a room. And I don't know, maybe Catherine and Karol do this kind of work, but I'm always mindful if people ask me to go and speak to a group, you think there might be somebody in the room who's just really looking to do something, or they want, you know, to hear somebody else's story, and it might help them. So it's a really important, that intergenerational thing is really important. And I think Karol's right, you know, people in their 70s and 80s who have been leaders and been inspirations for us, you know, we've got to do that as well for the next generation. And you know, the Grietas and those, they are an inspiration to all of us. So yeah, I think it's looking at doing this from a number of different perspectives. But yeah, follow your passion.
That's great. I can see we have one question in the chat, I think probably for Karol. So I agree with Karol that the economic system is broken. Would like to hear more about alternatives. We live in a world where multinationals have more power and wealth than individual governments. Of course, taxation and other measures are important, but they are unlikely to give up that power and wealth voluntarily. So Karol, I might leave that one with you for now.
Yeah, I mean, I think governments have collectively decided to give up that power. You know, it was a political choice to do so. And I think sometimes they overplay how much they've given up that power as well. So I think the most important thing to do is vote for governments that will fund public services, that will value human rights, that will value care, that will value the climate. You know, that is the answer to that. And you know, push for those alternatives. And again, I mean, the word alternative it doesn't really capture it, because it's what we had with the welfare state. So we want it back, please. You know, we just want less, you know, not to underestimate the level of climate action that has to happen, but there's a fundamental that we had, and that we have lost in the last 40 years from very, very deliberate economic policies driven initially by Thatcher and Reagan, but we are paying the price today. So get us back to, you know, governments that prioritize public services, that prioritize human rights, that prioritize the planet.
Thanks so much, Karol. My last question for our panelists is by far the easiest that I've asked for the last hour, and it's quite a nice one, but on a much lighter note, what's one movie, podcast, TV show, or book that you wish everyone knew about? Karol, I might start with you.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's a lighter note, but I've been absolutely gripped by Dope Sick. I thought it was absolutely amazing and kind of touches on a lot of the corporate greed that we've been talking about. But what I thought was fascinating about it was that it was the trial that the Sackler family never got them on TV, but it was fantastic viewing.
I just finished it myself and I sort of watched it half horrified the whole time, so completely agree. Catherine, what's on your kind of recommendation list?
I mean, it's a bit lame because it's political, but I do love Borgen, and they're coming out with a new season. So Borgen, she's awesome. She actually taught me she taught me many things in politics, but how to get out of a press conference. That she would just smile and then just leave. And when you're versed in politics, your inclination is always they ask another question and then you answer it, and then it's always a terrible answer, and then everyone's got to do damage control. But no, and I don't know, am I allowed to say Dairy Girls? I kind of like I just sometimes we need to laugh.
Yes, you are allowed to say Dairy Girls.
I mean, it's hilarious, and also it's also, you know, also poignant and sad. But my kids and I, we do, and my dad swears all the time. He says "feck," and so we're used to it.
Great. And Grainne, what's yours?
Yeah, again, you know, maybe not a lighter note, but just it's some really good content. I mean, people mentioned Mary Robinson. I mean, if you hadn't already listened to all of the Mothers of Invention, the podcast that herself and is it Maura Higgins, the stand-up comedian, did. I mean, who would have put Mary Robinson with a stand-up comedian? But it really works. It really worked well. And the women that they featured, some of the women maybe that Karol was talking about, local community women coming up with the answers to the big questions that people are scratching their heads about, and they're doing it. They're actually doing the change. And then there are two documentaries that if you're interested in, particularly Irish stories, one is called The 38th, which is a documentary, the story of marriage equality in Ireland. And it's a legacy documentary that the campaign made. And if you're looking for something late on a Netflix channel, you might pick it up. And then the second one is the story of the Repeal the Eighth Amendment campaign. And it's just called The Eighth. So again, just for the backstory of the people and the strategies, because so many of these campaigns were, you know, lessons learned in other jurisdictions brought to Ireland and not dropped, because you cannot drop stuff, but tweaked and changed and Irishized and came with, I believe, the proper result for 2 referenda that were really important for social change in Ireland.
Those are fantastic recommendations. I've written all the ones that I haven't watched or listened to down, so thank you all so much. That concludes our session today. I just want to say a huge thank you to the 3 of you. It's been just a fantastic chat. It's been great to get your perspectives, and it's also, I think, just always a good kind of feel-good boost to have these conversations with, I think, like-minded women in particular. And, you know, like I said to Grainne earlier, to have that sense of hope, that sense of optimism for the future, and that passion to keep going. So thank you so much for joining me. Thanks to all the audience today. Really enjoyed having you here, and happy St. Bridget's Day.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Well done. Thank you.